The room smelled of blood and fear. Lady Margaret lay on dirty sheets, her screams filling the stone castle. The old woman helping her birth the baby had blood on her hands up to her wrists. 3 other women held Margaret down on the bed made of straw. Outside, rain hit the windows like angry fists. "Push now, my lady, push, or you both die." The year was 1347, and death lived in every house. But here, in this hot room filled with smoke from burning plants and desperate prayers, death looked different. Not the quick end of a sword or sickness, but the slow breaking of bones and flesh that had killed her mother, her sister, and so many others whose names no one remembered. Margaret's nails dug into the wooden bed as pain tore through her body. 36 hours of trying to birth this child. The priest waited outside her door, ready with his holy oils for the dying. Another priest whispered Latin words that sounded like funeral prayers. Her husband walked back and forth in the hall below, already thinking about which of her young cousins might give him sons if she died tonight. The old woman's voice cut through the pain. "I can see the baby's head." "One more push, my lady, just one more." But as Margaret used the last of her strength, she knew this moment would decide everything. Not just if she lived or died, but the hard truth about being a woman in these times, where a lady's value came from the babies she could birth, where just staying alive was like fighting a war against a world that wanted to destroy her. The castle bells rang at dawn, calling the women to their first duty of the day. In the stone corridors of Château de Vincennes, Lady Eleanor pulled her woolen cloak tight against the morning cold. Her breath made small clouds in the air as she walked to the chapel, her soft leather shoes silent on the worn stones. Behind her came 6 other noble ladies, their heads covered, their eyes cast down as they had been taught since childhood. This was the world of the medieval lady, a world of rules written in blood and tradition. From the moment she could walk, Eleanor had learned the sacred order of things. Rise before dawn, pray until the sun climbed high, break fast with bread and weak ale, spend the morning hours with needle and thread, making the clothes that kept her family warm. The afternoon brought lessons in reading Latin prayers, though never the dangerous books that might fill her head with ideas above her station. The evening meal was a careful dance of silence and submission. Eleanor sat at the high table, her back straight, her hands folded, speaking only when spoken to. She watched her father's guests, lords and knights who spoke of wars and lands and politics, while she picked at her roasted meat and tried not to think about the life growing inside her belly. At 15, she was already married to a man twice her age, already carrying his child, already trapped in the golden cage that every noblewoman called home. But the castle held other women too, women whose lives moved in different rhythms. In the kitchens, Mary, the cook's wife, worked from before dawn until after dark. Her hands were scarred from hot pots and sharp knives, her back ached from lifting heavy stones and hauling water from the well. She had birthed 8 children and buried 5 of them before their second birthdays. The surviving 3 slept on straw in a room so small they could barely lie down together. Mary's days began in darkness, building fires that would burn all day. She kneaded bread dough until her arms screamed with pain. She gutted fish with bloody hands, turned meat on spits over roaring flames, and stirred huge pots of stew that fed 100 hungry people. When the nobles finished their fine meals, Mary cleaned their plates and goblets, scraped the scraps into buckets for the pigs, and finally fell onto her thin mattress near midnight, only to rise again before the stars faded. In the fields beyond the castle walls, peasant women like Anne lived even harder lives. She woke in a one-room hut made of mud and straw, shared with her husband, 4 living children, her husband's elderly mother, and whatever animals they owned. The floor was dirt. The roof leaked when it rained. In winter, the cold crept through every crack, and they huddled together for warmth around a fire that gave more smoke than heat. Anne's husband owned no land. They worked the Lord's fields from sunrise to sunset, planting grain in spring, cutting it in summer, gathering it in fall. Anne worked beside her husband, swinging a heavy scythe, carrying baskets of grain on her bent back, pulling weeds from endless rows under the burning sun. Her hands were black with dirt that never came clean. Her face was lined and weathered like old leather, though she was only 25 years old. When harvest time came, Anne worked until her body nearly broke. The Lord took most of the grain they grew. The church demanded its share. What little remained barely lasted through winter. Anne's youngest child had died last spring when the stored grain ran out, and there was nothing left to eat but grass and bark. She had held the tiny body while it grew cold, then buried it in the frozen ground with her own hands. The women of different levels rarely spoke to each other, but they all shared certain truths. They all knew the fear of childbirth, the pain that came with bringing new life into a world that might crush it. They all knew the weight of endless work, the ache in their backs and hands that never truly stopped. They all knew the silence expected of them, the way men's voices filled every room, while theirs were pushed into corners and whispers. Lady Eleanor might wear silk and eat from silver plates, but she too woke each morning wondering if this would be the day her husband grew tired of her, if this would be the pregnancy that killed her, if this would be the moment when her small world of privilege crumbled around her feet. The castle walls that seemed to protect her also held her prisoner. The fine clothes that marked her station also marked her as property. The marriage that gave her a title also gave her a master who could do with her as he pleased. In the great hall, tapestries told stories of brave knights and pure maidens, of love and honour and glory. But the real stories lived in the scars on working women's hands, in the graves of children who never reached their first birthdays, in the quiet desperation behind every woman's eyes. These were the stories no one wanted to tell, the truths that stayed hidden behind stone walls and polite smiles. The church taught that women's suffering was God's will, punishment for Eve's sin in the garden. The law said women were children who needed men to guide them. Custom declared that a woman's highest calling was to bear sons and serve in silence. And so they did, generation after generation, their pain and strength and wisdom locked away like secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. But secrets have a way of demanding to be heard. Behind the tapestries that hung in noble halls, darker truths festered like wounds that never healed. Lady Eleanor discovered the first secret on a winter morning when she found her young maid, Isabel, sobbing in the castle's dark storage room. Blood stained the girl's rough woolen dress, and her face was pale as candle wax. "My lady," Isabel whispered, her voice breaking, "please, I need the herb woman." Eleanor knew what this meant. Every woman in the castle knew, though none spoke of it openly. Isabel carried a child, but not from any marriage bed. The father was Lord William's eldest son, a man who took what he wanted from servant girls the way he might pluck apples from a tree. And now Isabel faced a choice that would damn her either way. In the shadows beyond the great hall, the herb woman lived in a tiny room that smelled of dried plants and whispered secrets. Old Margaret had delivered babies and buried the dead for 40 years. Her gnarled hands knew which roots could ease pain and which could stop a pregnancy before it showed. Noble ladies paid her in silver coins. Servant girls traded their few possessions. Peasant women brought her eggs or cheese, anything to buy the bitter tea that would wash away their shame. But this knowledge came with a price written in blood. If caught, the herb woman would burn. If discovered, the desperate mothers would hang. The church called it murder, the law called it witchcraft, yet still they came, night after night, carrying their terror and their hope in equal measure. Eleanor watched Isabel drink the dark liquid, saw her double over in pain as her body expelled what might have been. 3 days later, the girl was back to scrubbing floors and serving meals, but something had died in her eyes that would never return. Lord William's son never acknowledged what had happened. He married a duke's daughter that spring and forgot Isabel like yesterday's meal. In the peasant villages, the secrets grew darker still. When winter hunger bit deep and there was no food left, mothers made choices that would haunt their dreams forever. Anne had watched her neighbour, Sarah, carry her newborn daughter into the woods one February night when the snow fell thick and the stored grain was gone. Sarah returned alone, her empty arms clutched across her chest, her eyes hollow as empty wells. The practice had no name, but every woman knew it. When there were too many mouths and not enough food, when another child meant all the children would starve, mothers made the walk into the dark forest. The church condemned it as murder, but the church fathers had never held a dying child while listening to their other children cry from hunger. They had never counted the last handful of grain and known it would not last until spring. Some women tried other paths. They bound their bellies tight with rough cloth, trying to hide their growing shape until the child was born. Then they would claim the baby came early, that it died from its weakness. The village women would nod and say nothing, understanding the lie that kept them all safe from questions they could not answer. But the cruelest secrets belonged to the marriage bed itself. Lady Eleanor learned this truth on her wedding night, when her 40-year-old husband showed her what submission really meant. His hands were not gentle, his voice was not kind. When she cried, he told her this was woman's burden, the price she paid for her fine clothes and full belly. Night after night she lay still while he took what he called his right. When she bore him a daughter instead of the son he wanted, he struck her across the face hard enough to loosen a tooth. When she miscarried the next child, he blamed her weakness and found comfort in the beds of servant girls who could not refuse him. The marriage contract spoke of honour and protection, but Eleanor discovered that honour was a word men used when it suited them. Protection meant being locked in a tower when she displeased her husband, being denied food when she spoke without permission, being beaten when she questioned his authority. The fine ladies in her family had taught her to embroider and sing, but they had never told her that her body would become a battlefield, where she was always the conquered territory. In the villages, marriage brought different terrors but the same helplessness. When Anne's husband drank too much ale, his fists found her face and ribs with practiced accuracy. When she tried to protect their children from his rage, he reminded her that the law gave him the right to discipline his family as he saw fit. The village priest told her to pray for patience and remember that suffering brought her closer to God. Anne's sister had tried to escape her violent husband by running to a convent, but the nuns sent her back. Marriage was a sacred bond, they said. A wife's duty was to endure, to suffer in silence, to transform pain into virtue through prayer and submission. The bruises faded, but the lesson remained. There was no escape, no rescue, no justice that would hear a woman's voice above a man's claims. The herb woman knew other secrets too. She had seen what happened when desperate women tried to end pregnancies with sharp sticks or poisonous plants they found in the forest. She had held their hands while they bled to death on her floor, whispering final confessions into her ear. She had closed their eyes and helped bury them in unmarked graves, then told their families they had died of fever or women's troubles. Anything but the truth that would see them refused burial in holy ground. And sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, she helped women disappear entirely. When a husband's violence grew too savage, when a father's touch became something unholy, when death seemed preferable to another day of torture, the herb woman knew paths through the forest that led to other villages, other names, other lives. These women became ghosts, abandoning everything they had ever known for the slim chance of survival in a world that offered them no legal protection. But secrets are like seeds planted in poisoned soil. They grow in darkness, feeding on shame and fear until they burst into the light with terrible consequences. The screaming began at midnight on the Feast of St. Agnes. Lady Eleanor woke to the sound of her maid Isabel shrieking in the courtyard below, her voice raw with terror that cut through the January cold like a blade through silk. Eleanor pressed her face to the narrow window and saw torches blazing in the darkness, casting wild shadows on the stone walls as armed men dragged the herb woman from her small room. Old Margaret's grey hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her nightgown was torn where rough hands had pulled her from her bed. Blood ran from her nose where someone had struck her. The village priest stood beside Lord William, holding a leather bag filled with dried plants and small glass bottles that gleamed like accusations in the firelight. "Witchcraft," the priest declared, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "Tools of the devil, used to murder innocent babes and corrupt the natural order God has ordained." Eleanor's hands went to her own belly, where another child grew. 3 months along, and already she feared what this pregnancy might bring. The herb woman had helped her through the bleeding sickness that had nearly killed her with the last child. Now that knowledge, that mercy, would burn with the woman who possessed it. The trial lasted 2 days. They stripped Margaret naked and searched her wrinkled body for the devil's marks, moles and scars that proved her unholy bargain. They dunked her in the frozen pond until she nearly drowned, then declared her survival proof of supernatural protection. When she confessed under torture to consorting with demons, they nodded as if they had known. All along. But Margaret's confession brought down others like dominoes falling, in a line. Desperate to end her pain, she named every woman who had ever sought her help. Lady Eleanor heard her own name whispered in the crowd and felt her knees grow weak. Isabel sobbed openly now, knowing her turn would come. In the village, Anne clutched her youngest child and wondered if her neighbour Sarah would remember their walks in the forest, their quiet conversations about choices no woman should have to make. The burnings began on a grey morning when frost covered the ground like scattered bones. Margaret went first, tied to a wooden stake while the priest read Latin prayers that sounded like curses. The flames caught slowly in the damp air, and her screams lasted longer than anyone wanted to remember. The smoke carried the smell of burning flesh across the village, a scent that would linger in their dreams for years to come. 3 more women followed her to the fire that week. Sarah, the mother who had walked into the woods on that snowy night, burned on Tuesday. Her husband watched with empty eyes as the flames consumed the woman who had borne him 6 children. The village children were made to watch, to learn what happened to those who defied God's will. But the real horror came in what followed. Fear spread through the castle and village like plague, turning neighbour against neighbour, mother against daughter, sister against sister. Women who had once shared their secrets now watched each other with suspicious eyes. The servant girls jumped at every shadow, knowing that any day might bring an accusation that would see them dragged to the fire. Lady Eleanor felt the change in her own body as much as in her surroundings. Without the herb woman's knowledge, childbirth became a journey into darkness with no guide to light the way. When her labour pains began on a rain-soaked night in April, there was no one left who knew the old remedies for stopping bleeding or easing pain. The young midwife who came instead had hands that shook with fear and eyes that darted toward the door as if expecting the priest to appear with his accusations. Eleanor's daughter was born blue and silent. The midwife worked frantically, slapping the tiny back, breathing into the small lungs. But the child never drew breath. They wrapped the body in white cloth and buried it in the castle yard, while Eleanor wept tears that seemed to come from some deep well of grief that had no bottom. In the village, women began to die in childbed at twice the rate they had before. Without the herb woman's teas to strengthen them or stop infection, they bled to death on straw mattresses while their families watched helplessly. The knowledge that had kept them alive for generations was gone, burned to ash with the women who carried it. Anne lost her sister that summer, dead 3 days after giving birth to twin boys who lived only hours longer than their mother. The village priest said it was God's will, but Anne saw the truth in the midwife's frightened face. There had been remedies for the fever that killed her sister, medicines that could have saved both mother and babies, but that knowledge was now forbidden, condemned as witchcraft, buried with the women who had dared to help. The fear changed how women moved through their days. They spoke in whispers, always watching to see who might be listening. They hid their monthly bleeding more carefully, knowing that any sign of women's mysteries might be seen as evidence of dark magic. They burned the herbs they had once dried for healing, afraid that possession of such things would see them follow Margaret to the flames. In the castle, Lord William took a new young wife before Eleanor's body had healed from her failed childbirth. The girl was 14, frightened, and knew nothing of the ways women had once protected themselves and each other. Eleanor tried to warn her, to share what little knowledge she still dared possess, but the words died in her throat. Speaking such things now meant death. The new lady gave birth 6 months later to a son who lived only 3 days, without the herb woman's wisdom about keeping newborns warm and helping them breathe, without the teas that could fight the fevers that killed so many infants. The castle nursery became a place of constant mourning. Lord William buried 5 children in 2 years, each small grave a testament to the knowledge that had been destroyed in the name of God's righteousness. But perhaps the cruelest aftermath was not in the deaths, but in how the living changed. Women who had once helped each other now turned away from their neighbours' suffering. To offer aid might mean accusations of witchcraft. To share knowledge might mean the fire. So they watched in silence as their sisters died, carrying their guilt like stones in their chests. The bonds that had held women together for centuries, the quiet network of shared wisdom, mutual aid, and whispered comfort, crumbled like ancient parchment touched by flame. In trying to purify their world, the men had poisoned it instead, creating a wasteland where women died alone and afraid, their knowledge lost, their strength scattered like ashes on the wind. Winter came early that year, settling over the land like a shroud that would not lift. In the castle's highest tower, Lady Eleanor sat by a window that looked out over the graveyard, where too many small stones marked too many short lives. Her hands, once soft and pale, now bore the calluses of a woman who had learned to birth her own children without help, to tend her own wounds without medicine, to face each new pregnancy as a gamble with death. The new knowledge she possessed was different from what the herb woman had carried. This was knowledge born of desperation, learned through pain, paid for with the lives of women who had no choice but to discover it. Eleanor knew which prayers to whisper when the bleeding would not stop. She knew how to tie cloth strips to slow a dangerous birth. She knew how to hold a dying child so its final breaths came peacefully. But she also knew the terrible mathematics of survival. For every woman who lived, another died. For every child born healthy, 2 more were buried before their first winter ended. The wisdom that had once saved so many was gone, and what remained was rough and incomplete, like trying to rebuild a cathedral with nothing but broken stones. In the village below, Anne walked the same paths her mother and grandmother had walked, but the world beneath her feet had changed in ways that could never be undone. The cottage where the herb woman had lived stood empty, its windows boarded shut like blind eyes. Weeds grew through cracks in the threshold where desperate women had once waited for healing. The very air seemed different, as if the smoke from those burning days had stained the sky permanently grey. Anne's youngest daughter was now the age Isabel had been when the troubles started. The girl asked questions about the old stories, about the women who had come before, about why her monthly bleeding felt like a shameful secret instead of a natural thing. But Anne found herself whispering answers instead of speaking them clearly, still afraid that the wrong words might bring the torches back to her door. The men who had ordered the burnings were mostly dead now. Lord William had perished in a hunting accident, his neck broken when his horse threw him at a stream his grandfather had crossed safely 1,000 times. The priest who had condemned the herb women had died of a fever that consumed him slowly, his final days spent crying out for medicines his own actions had destroyed. But their legacy lived on in the fear that still haunted every woman's heart. Sometimes, on nights when the wind howled through the castle walls, Eleanor thought she heard voices in the darkness. The screams of women burning, the cries of children who had died without proper care, the whispered confessions of mothers who had lost their faith in God's mercy. She wondered if the ghosts of those who had perished were trying to tell her something important, some final secret that might ease the suffering of those still living. In the years that followed, new herb women arose, but they worked in deeper shadows, trusted fewer people, charged higher prices for the danger they faced. Their knowledge was fragmentary, pieced together from whatever could be remembered and whatever could be discovered through careful experimentation on the bodies of women who had no other choice. Some of the old wisdom was recovered. Much of it was lost forever. Young women grew up hearing whispered warnings about the burning times, learning to hide their understanding of their own bodies, to speak of women's mysteries only in the darkest corners of rooms where no men might overhear. They learned that knowledge itself could be a crime, that helping other women could mean death, that survival sometimes meant watching others suffer in silence. But the most haunting question was not about what had been lost, or even about what might be recovered. The question that hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire was simpler and more terrible. Why had it been so easy? Why had the accusations spread so quickly, the confessions come so readily, the flames burned so bright? Why had some women pointed fingers at their neighbours to save themselves? Why had others stood silent when they might have spoken? Why had the bonds between women, forged over centuries of shared suffering, broken so easily when tested by fear? Eleanor thought about this question as she watched her daughter grow, as she saw the girl learn to hide her intelligence behind downcast eyes and folded hands. Was there something in the nature of women that made them vulnerable to such destruction? Or was there something in the nature of power that required women's wisdom to be periodically purged, like weeds pulled from a garden to keep the other plants from growing too wild? The castle bells still rang at dawn, calling the living to prayer and the dead to memory. The same stones supported the same walls, but the world they contained had been forever altered. The tapestries still told stories of brave knights and pure maidens, but now those stories felt like lies, or at best like dreams of a world that had never truly existed. In the village church, new mothers brought their infants to be blessed, praying to the same God who had watched their sisters burn. The priest spoke of divine mercy and eternal love, while standing on ground still stained with the ashes of women who had dared to ease suffering and preserve life. The contradiction hung in the air like incense, sweet-smelling but poisonous, beautiful but deadly. And in the deepest darkness of winter nights, when the wind carried voices that might have been memory or might have been prophecy, the unanswered question echoed through empty corridors and silent hearts. If it happened once, if fear could so easily destroy what love had built, if the bonds between women could be broken by nothing more than whispered accusations and borrowed terror, then what would prevent it from happening again? The herbs grew back in the forest. The babies continued to be born. The women learned new ways to help each other, more careful ways, more hidden ways. But the knowledge that their strength could be turned against them, that their very existence could be seen as a threat worthy of flames, remained like a seed planted deep in the soil of every woman's soul, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again into fresh horror. The question remained, and remains, and will remain. How easily might it all burn again?